Thank you everyone for joining us today on this Tuesday evening or early afternoon if you're on the East Coast to hear what I'm hoping is going to be a really lively discussion with Professor Kasey McCall-Smith on the recent overturning of Roe v. Wade. This was settled law in the United States, seeming for a time. It was decided in 1973 and determined that the right to an abortion was protected under the constitutional right to privacy. So in opening this conversation, I will be asking Professor Kasey McCall-Smith to offer some opening remarks and give some insight on this issue. Professor Kasey McCall-Smith is a lecturer of public international law and the program director for the LLM in human rights at the University of Edinburgh. She's a qualified US lawyer where she's practiced for several years before moving to academics. Her research interests include law of treaties, treaty implementation, and interpretation in national legal systems, and human rights. And without further ado, I will cede the floor to Professor Smith to make some opening remarks. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you, Alexandra, for having me, and thanks to everyone who has joined. So today we're basically talking about Dobbs versus the Jackson Women's Health Organization and what its impact is on abortion rights in the US. And I think more fundamentally, even aside from abortion rights, it's what it means for women and their right to healthcare in the US, because abortion is a healthcare right, and I think that that has been made very clear over and over again. And I think the way that the Supreme Court crafted their decision in what is clearly a partisan approach to the questions that were before it, I think that they tried to craft it in a way that suggested that it wasn't about women's rights. In fact, they very clearly said it's not about women, and excluded women from being a concern of the 14th Amendment, which is the Equal Protection Clause to the US Constitution. And they made it about state versus federal power, about an overreach, suggesting that Roe and Kasey, the subsequent case that reinforced and affirmed Roe v. Wade, they made it seem like the court in those situations had overstepped the way in which the Constitution should be and indeed was interpreted. And that has a lot to do with the way in which really conservative members of the court historically have reflected on interpretation of the Constitution, whether they are an originalist or whether constructivists or whether they recognize that the Constitution has to evolve, in fact, to match those changes in society. And I think that's really what they tried to make the case about, to distract from the fact that they have that this decision has an irreparable impact on the women who will not be able to access abortion with any type of ease. So effectively, those women who are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, who might be suffering from religious oppression in very oppressive households from their parents. And I think this does not bode well for women's mental health, for their equality in all things. And I think, you know, an unwanted pregnancy or an unintended pregnancy for people in the in this category, you know, it's not what many Republicans have framed it as, is, oh, it's just people being lazy about their birth control and using abortion as birth control. And in reality, that's not what abortion is used for. It is to keep people from, you know, going further into economic depredation, to keep them safe from abuse. It's to keep them you know, healthy as they can possibly be in whatever circumstances they might be in. Now, it doesn't mean that it hasn't been used as a form of birth control, but the point is I think that this case took us away from what Roe tried to provide, which was an opportunity for women to make the decision for themselves. Effectively, what Dobbs has done is it has taken women's ability to choose away. And while this has really, you know, been a boon for the religious right, what does that mean for the rest of the people who aren't overly religious, who don't have the ability to travel to get an abortion, it means that we will revert to backstreet abortions in the way that happened prior to Roe v. Wade and prior to the institution of many of the more liberalized abortion laws that have come into play in the last 40 years. So in fact, I read a statistic today that said that this decision in the US and the ensuing trigger laws that went into effect, this represents the first instance where there have been retrogressive abortion laws in the past 25 years, which I think says something about the US, and it's not something that is nice about the US, nor does it speak to their interest in women's equality and their ability to control their bodies. So I think I'll start there, and you can ask questions, Alexandra, if you want, and I can respond as it works for you.
Yes, that's perfect. I think that one of the interesting things that you touched upon is that while this may be an issue that Republicans and conservatives have been pushing for quite a long time, that there's still a lot of states that have really liberal abortion laws and that have made efforts to constitutionalize the right to abortion at the state level. California took a measure recently, I know, in the wake of the new decision. Nancy Pelosi even highlighted that American women today have less rights than their mothers and less freedom than their mothers. So that was something that I was hoping you could comment on, is the basically tale of two Americas, how because of the way that our state legislatures are set up, that we have some states like Louisiana, a lot of southern, more conservative states that have totally different rights. Women have totally different rights than women in certain other states. And it's caused a lot of questions about whether or not women should be allowed to cross state lines to receive access to abortion in other states. So I was hoping that you could comment on that. I know that this was an issue when we had gay marriage at the state level, but not at the federal level yet, and people crossing state lines. I know there's been a recent case in Ohio as well, where a young woman, not even a young woman, a child, crossed a border in order to receive an abortion. And there were discussions as to whether or not the doctor who provided that abortion would be under any kind of investigation. So I was hoping that you could comment on that and the sort of divided lines that America is currently under.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question. And someone asked me the other day what I thought about how states would be able to prohibit women from crossing the border. And I can't see any way that could actually happen, aside from possibly a minor. I mean, it's different from the gay marriage and recognition of gay marriage, because they're taking a proactive legal, they're having a relationship framed in law, and states do have the ability to limit who can be married and the terms under which they can be married. That is a constitutional, that is something that's very clear in the Constitution. But here, when you have someone that is going and really, when women have historically traveled, I mean, I'm from Arkansas, and, as I've said before, I would need multiple hands to count how many people I know had abortions, but who traveled across state lines in order to receive an abortion without having to abide by the very restrictive abortion laws that Arkansas already had. Being under 18, having to get parental consent, I mean, that just doesn't happen when you are talking about ultra-conservative families. And so many of these girls were forced, if they couldn't get abortions very discreetly in another state, they would have been forced to have a child and give it up for adoption, or to marry, which often frequently happened. So we've got lots of contradicting and very contentious rights that are all wound up together. And so I think, stopping an individual from crossing a state line. I mean, it's not like in the US, there are border controls between states. So, the thing about gay marriage and the recognition of the marriage once they're in a different state, that's a completely separate issue. If a woman wants to go on holiday to another state and gets an abortion in private, there's a good chance. But, that is for women who can afford it. And the women who can afford it have always been able to have abortions. It didn't matter what the law was. And that, I would say, is the truth. And if you look at like the global statistics on abortion and the incidence of abortion, it doesn't matter if you're in a country that has restrictive abortion laws or one that has very liberal abortion laws. The number of women getting abortions tends to actually be higher, from the most recent information that I've read, tends to be higher in those countries that have restrictive abortion laws. So I think all they're going to do is drive abortion underground and encourage women to go further afield to get abortions in more liberal states such as Maryland or California. So I think it's not doing anyone any favors, but the people that will pay will be those women who can't afford to do that and who are forced to have children that they can't afford to raise, because America is extremely unequal in its socioeconomic interest, in terms of the haves and the have-nots. And, I think there are countless, reports on poverty in the US. And, if you look at those who are in the greatest amounts of poverty, it's because, they might have multiple children, not always, but, that is an indicator because they haven't had access to healthcare. And so it just creates a vicious cycle.
Right. I think that that's something that is really often missing from the conversation, is it seems really clear cut about how Republicans want to approach the abortion conversation, but it's not often paired with conversations about then expanding welfare and expanding education access and childcare access for women who, as you said, don't have the financial means to support having another child. And also it comes in the wake of years of attacks on organizations like Planned Parenthood, who a majority of the work that they do is really is medical and providing education and birth control access and those sorts of things, which would prevent pregnancy, obviously. So I think that's something that is, often left out of the conversation that you sort of touched on.
Yeah, and I think also is that their conversations, they fail to understand the links between unwanted pregnancies and unwanted births, and then what happens when these children are neglected, or their parents just can't care for them. So I mean, it's not shocking to find out that in the US you have the highest percentage of children incarcerated, almost than anywhere in the world. So, on any given day, as of, I think, in 2019, 2018, on any given day, there would be roughly 48,000 children incarcerated in some form of quasi-judicial or administrative detention in the US. And that's also with about 4,500 of those actually in the US prison service. I mean, that is just wrong. And, I think they haven't connected the dots, even though lots of criminal justice researchers have connected the dots. Politicians don't seem to care. And particularly when they can thump that Bible really hard and say, God says this is wrong, but God also says leaving, people in poverty and without any support is wrong, but they seem to only get half the message. They don't like to have that full circle conversation. And I think that's a problem. And this whole idea that there is a separation of church and state, as the Constitution suggests that there should be, that seems to be less true these days. Like you were saying, this, kind of this two different Americas, and it's a very white conservative America versus everybody else.
Right. I think that another issue is basically the politicization of the courts, which you mentioned at the very beginning. And I was hoping that you could sort of say something about how we've gotten up to this point, given that for a long time, Roe was looked upon sort of as settled law, something that even the nominees for the Supreme Court, when they were in the nomination process, said that they weren't interested in touching, that they respected that it was settled law, and also that a majority of public opinion polls show that people in the US are fine with having access to safe abortions. So how have we sort of come to this point where now you're sort of subject to whatever your state legislature says, as opposed to having this as a federal protection? Sort of how have we come up to this point? Or is this something that especially women's rights groups have seen for a long time coming, and yet we've failed to sort of codify Roe or implement any stronger protections for abortion rights in the US?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something, there's an old saying about the US Supreme Court, when at least the one comfort is that when they make a really bad decision, that we only have to sit with it for a little while, because the court will turn over. Now that's, as as the dissenting opinion said, at least in the Dobbs case, that it's just one of the many cold comforts, I think, of this decision, in that it doesn't do any good for those women who are going to be subjected to these really draconian laws in the coming years. But I have no doubt there will already be another challenge being raised and being framed more appropriately in the Equal Protection Clause, because the majority opinion in the Dobbs case suggested that this has nothing to do with equal protection because abortion is not a gendered issue. Well, I beg to differ. If we're saying that maternal health care is not a gendered issue, well, even if some people who are pregnant do not any longer identify as women, that is one of the issues that, I'm sorry, but a woman biologically is the only person that can, carry a child. And so I can't think of anything that's less gendered than the issue of reproductive health rights. And abortion has to be part of that mix of reproductive health rights. And so I think, it's very disappointing in how politicized the court is. And I think that, as Americans, it seems it's very difficult to swallow. Roe v. Wade is a decision that is older than I am and you are. And as you said, this is something that's been around our entire lives, and thinking that this was at least something that provided women protection in the awful incidents that they might have to seek an abortion. But, I think it's even more problematic than that, in that they don't seem to, the Supreme Court in its decision doesn't give any, consideration for those women who might not be able to carry, a pregnancy to term. And I think, I think at least when I had my first child, I remember an obstetrician telling me, asking if it was my first pregnancy. And I said, yes. And they were like, oh, well, most women have a natural miscarriage their very first time to get pregnant. Like over 50% of women do that. They never even know they're pregnant and they miscarry because that's just your body. That happens naturally. Well, what happens to those women? And there are loads of cases. Rebecca Smith, who's at Birmingham City University, she's done loads of work on comparative work on women's reproductive health rights, and the numbers of women that miscarry spontaneously, going into the second trimester, that's not uncommon, particularly in economically deprived areas. And so what happens to these women? Are we going to be like the former kind of major Latin American approach and prosecute these women who have spontaneously and naturally had an abortion? It's not like they had an abortion, it's if they miscarried. But that has often been framed as an abortion in these places where there are very retrogressive and regressive abortion laws. So, that is the fear. And I think that the dissenting opinion in the Dobbs case, calls these points out, saying, look, the majority opinion gives no consideration of all of these other instances that in history we've seen states charging women with criminal offenses for doing something that that they have no control over. Nature is nature. And, even if you don't have an abortion, there's no guarantee that you'll have a baby. In the UK, we have the largest number of stillbirths stillbirths for any developing country, and no one can explain that number. So what happens to those women? So, there's a lot that, despite the decision being quite lengthy, I think there's a lot that the majority opinion doesn't say. And I think the only way that we can address it in the US is for, it's horrible to even have to say that, to get out and vote. And I do hope that it has a massive impact on the midterm elections. But more importantly, I really hope it motivates women and men to get active and to protest. I know there have been loads of protests, but they need to protest in these states that are so conservative, because, I was in Arkansas just before the decision came down, and talking to people, they were really scared, because actually they're really worried that this will have a knock-on effect. And it's actually, I think it's not as contentious, obviously, in states that aren't as conservative, but I think that this to America's picture isn't really about kind of North and South or West and East or anything like that. It's actually those conservative states, because the conservative majority is very slim. And even in those states, there are large amounts of people who aren't getting their rights protected. And that is not really democracy. I mean, and that's definitely not how human rights are meant to be realized. And so this concept of equality isn't really group equality. It's about individual equality. And this decision does not deliver that in any way. And it took great pains to not touch that subject as well.
Of course, and I think something that ties into that that's sort of left out of the larger conversation is that a lot of what Roe had to do with was the right to privacy, as guaranteed in the Constitution, and that's something that will have an effect on larger conversations that maybe conservatives don't want those things infringed upon, but they're happy to have this conversation about women's rights and women's abortion. So could you say something maybe about sort of the larger conversation that the Supreme Court case might have on precedent moving forward in regards to the right to privacy?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, I don't know. I mean, the right to privacy, I mean, it's one of these things. So I think what would be really interesting is someone, if they did work on where the Supreme Court tends to be quite liberal on right to privacy cases. They tend to be things that benefit the already highly benefited parts of the population, I guess we should say. And so I think looking at how they interpret and what tools they use, I mean, what really struck me in this opinion was this constant recourse to the original meaning of the Constitution. Well, I mean, the original meaning of the Constitution was over 200 years ago. What benefit does that give us now? I mean, we have to think about it as it has grown with the population, and we can't limit the interpretation of the Constitution. So I think it would be really interesting to see where the court actually falls on the right to privacy when it doesn't involve women, because I get this, I have the suspicion that when it has to do with issues that are more concern of men, possibly they're not, because they definitely haven't made any moves to discuss how this relates to men who are seeking out Viagra, so or medicine that helps them get women pregnant. So I think there's got to be some kind of reckoning. I mean, that's work for someone else to do, but I do think that this concept of the right to privacy, they aren't being consistent. I think that's definite. And I think that doesn't bode well for people's faith in the court, which I think is also a shame, because I've always been a huge supporter of the US court system and the fact that the court can strike down laws. So I think, the issue of whether the federal government will step in and create a federal law, I mean, I think that makes the most sense. How they do that will be very interesting, because they would have to frame it as something that is in line with one of the constitutional amendments. I mean, I would say it'd have to go through the 14th Amendment, but how they do that without getting massive backlash, I mean, I don't know, because I don't think that the Constitution requires the right to abortion. I think that the right to equality and the right to make decisions for yourself should encompass many things, including the right to abortion. I don't think the Constitution has ever required us being so explicit. And I think that the Equality Clause, and coupled with the right to privacy, should be enough, but clearly that wasn't the case. So I think the only way to do that is prospectively consider, who's going to be sitting on this court? Do we want a more restrictive court? Where is that going to take us? It's
Yeah, I
not
think
pretty.
that moving forward, something that has been discussed is obviously there's conversations in the US about expanding the court, or packing the court, as we say. And I was hoping that you might give some insight into sort of what we can do to strengthen the court. The court in the United States has always been seen as kind of the last line of defense for laws that are controversial, or for sort of maintaining the rule of law. And it sort of seems that we're moving in an opposite direction, where the court, obviously, like we've said, has become highly politicized. And even the eventual Supreme Court nominees, who during their nomination process sort of gave false indications as to what they would do as as justices has become something where Americans are really lacking faith, I think, in the courts, whereas in the past, because it's not so politicized, it was one of the more favored institutions. So I was hoping that you can comment on that in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think that the fact that several of the more recent nominees completely went against what they said during their appointment processes and during the Senate hearings. How we rectify that, I don't know. I mean, but I think that I don't think it's beneficial for the court in any instance to have justices that are so left or right. I think that moderate judges that really take their role as interpreters of the law, rather than, making expansive and massive changes to the law. I think that isn't useful, and I think that undermines the faith in the court that people have, because the court is meant to, I think there's a twofold, purpose for the court. I think it's meant to interpret and ensure that the Constitution survives, but it also has to interpret the Constitution in a way that makes sense. So there's a bit of socio-political recognition that has to come into line with the court, and I think that's one of the tricky parts about American jurisprudence because of the stare decisis principle, and they also, the way that the court, when they review things, they can only review what was raised in a previous setting. So there's not as much leeway to think about, well, what about the fact that the American population, over 60% of the American population, according to most polls, say that there should be access to abortion, to safe abortion. And so how do we rectify that? I mean, the senators have the final say. And if we elect, senators, and if there continue to be senators elected that are so regressive and that have so little interest in their, in the people who can't donate to their campaigns, then I don't know where that leaves the American public. And I think that's actually, I think that this, it's very disheartening, I think, as a lawyer. And it also takes you away from kind of like all of the great things that you think about the Constitution as as you're studying it, and as you go to law school, and you think, oh, what an amazing document, because it is capable of growing with the population and the country. But here it shows that maybe this particular panel of judges isn't capable of recognizing what that needs to be. So yeah, so I mean, I think I really don't know how, what more I can say in terms of how it goes, because like I said, the only way that we get judges is when there's a vacancy and through the Senate confirmation hearings. And I think what we need are actually, I think it's not just the court that has gone so far to the extremes. I mean, it's not just the court that's seeming very politicized. There used to be, I mean, when I worked on the Hill many years ago, politicians weren't so nasty, and politics wasn't so nasty. So you could be a moderate politician, and you could be a Republican or a Democrat, and you could find middle ground and be much more willing to forge a road and a way forward. But now it seems so politicized that you have to be super far left or super far right, or you don't get elected. And I think that is what's exacerbating all of the tensions in the US. And I think that I think on a day-to-day basis, when you're talking to the average person on the street, they don't feel those tensions because they've actually just blanked all of, they're just not interested in Fox News. They're not interested in CNN. They're not interested in all of these opinions. What they want is just, can I feed my family? Can I pay my bills? And, what's going to happen tomorrow? They don't have time to be too caught up in it. It's only for those of us who it's our job or we make the time. And I think that's, unfortunately, people are fed up.
Yeah, I think that that's something that's really, really important to talk about. And I remember being in Europe when this decision was made, and it's very difficult to explain to people that it's a whole constellation of issues. Like you said, it's not just going and voting. It's the fact that our constitution is a really, in some ways, a vague document, a very livable document. It's it's something that we have an almost godlike reverence for in the United States, and something that is extremely hard to change. And especially given our political landscape, and even going back to our campaign finance laws, it becomes increasingly difficult to have really moderate politicians in office who are then electing or nominating Supreme Court justices who then will make, sort of reasoned decisions that are in the best interest of the American public and that are in line with our Constitution. So kind of going towards a more global context, and I want to say to the audience members that you're welcome to pop in any questions that you might have in the chat for us to pose, but kind of going to a more global context, do you think that this is something that will be really harmful in the future for the US, kind of with our normative value promotion? It's really difficult to criticize regimes that have very strict women's rights laws and these sorts of things, when we ourselves are really struggling to make a convincing argument that women are equal members of our society when they don't have as many rights as their male counterparts, and don't have the autonomy to say, this is a decision that I want to make for myself and for my family. So I'd be interested to hear your sort of perspective on the more global implications of this decision.
Yeah, I mean, arguably, I would say no one has seriously considered the US a human rights norm entrepreneur or even, I don't think anyone's looked to the US for leadership in the area of human rights in quite a while. I mean, I think they pretty much undermine their own ability to speak and to actually have people listen with their post 9/11 war on terror. I mean, I think that wasn't the first time that they've undermined, the rhetoric that they present and the demands that they make on other countries. That's not the first time, obviously, but I think it's been so public since then. And, it's not just with their war on terror and the way that they treated potential terrorists, but it's also the animosity that they've shown refugees, children, women, the horrible ways in which the ICE campaign against, people crossing the southern border. I think it's this increasingly inward approach to the exclusion of all others. And I think that the US's approach to human rights has always been slightly different than the rest of the world. And here in this opinion, you see that very clearly. So they are very much thinking of women as a massive group. And they're not even they're thinking of citizens as a massive group, not even concerned about women's role as part of the citizenry. But they also are not thinking of, human rights is about how an individual can be equal, be free, exercise their liberty. And that might mean to the, in a distinct way from other people, as long as they're not harming others. So, what does it say that if a poor, minority individual or even a poor white girl can't get an abortion because she knows she can't afford to have a baby, what kind of message is that sending out? Because what it says to me as an American who doesn't live in the US anymore, it sends to me a message that says, we don't care about those people. They don't count. And, what does that say to other countries when the US is telling them how to run their show and their human rights? I don't think I personally have not put much stock in the US's approach to human rights in some time. And, as you said at the beginning, my area of expertise is treaty law. And I can very definitively remember having this conversation to the lawyer who advised the US when they were ratifying the ICCPR. And I said, well, the US hasn't done anyone any favors by being party to the ICCPR. And he said, well, should we not have not ratified? And I said, would it have made a difference? I don't think you've made a difference. So no, why does it matter that the US is ratified? Because, basically the reservations and those have an impact, and it sets a bad precedent for others, a bad standard. And I think that, here, what I hope is that other countries don't look to the US, but I think actually almost, particularly in the Latin American system, in the American system, the US has also almost farcically made itself the counterpoint. So now those states that are actually trying to entrench human rights, so that we don't want to be like the US. We actually want to be more progressive because they are, they're going backwards. So I think, that the US and its leadership role has passed, and I think it's going to take a lot to maybe try and get that back. Not that there aren't people doing amazing work on human rights and norm development in general, but I think that the past 2 decades, the US has really shot itself in the foot, and it's going to take a long time to get the faith back from the more, the broader global community of states and people.
I mean, sort of touching on, the work being done by human rights advocates in the United States, and you sort of saw some protests and the sort of backlash when Roe was overturned. Do you have anything, sort of to hopefully end on a bit more of a positive note, do you have anything hopeful that you're keeping in mind for the future in the United States, and hoping that maybe the November midterm elections will bring about a larger majority for progressives who can then make efforts to perhaps codify more laws to protect women's rights and access to abortion? Because even before it was a rights issue, it was always also an access issue. Even in states where abortion was allowed, I mean, there was, I think, 2 abortion clinics in all of Texas for a time. And, women don't have, if you don't have the ability or time or money to travel to, a distant place in the United States, is obviously a massive country, then the rights conversation is a bit irrelevant because there's no access. So I was hoping that we may end on something more positive, looking forward. If you have any thoughts of sort of either encouragement or reflection on this issue that you might want to share with us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think there's always, a silver lining. And I think that because many people, my age and older, we thought that Roe was so watertight that it wouldn't be overturned, that possibly we got a little too complacent. And I think that this decision has galvanized people. And I think that that's evident from social media, from news reporting, from looking at all of the research that's being generated as a result of what's happening, and comparative analysis between what's going on in the US and other countries. I see that somebody asked a question about that, Felipe. Hello. And so I think it's, I think that the silver lining and what's hopeful is also, if you look at the statistics about who approved of the decision or strongly approved of the decision and who disapproved, the disapproval rates, the younger the people get, the higher the disapproval rates. And that's not just for Democrats, that's for Republicans that were canvassed as part of the most recent Pew research that's been done. And to me, that says that means that things will change, because the people who strongly supported the Supreme Court decision, they tend to be older, and they won't be here forever. So I mean, to make an obvious point. So it looks like the younger generation. So if you look at the 40-year-olds and younger, then when you get to the 18-year-olds who've been surveyed, they're like, this is wrong. This isn't going to happen. This isn't going to stay. So I think that continual, there will be work, and this will have galvanized women to start, more openly defending women and their rights, and to be advocating for it. And, you've seen so many doctors coming out saying, I will offer my services for free for any woman who needs an abortion, blah, blah, blah. There've been loads of people coming out of out and saying, we are going to make this happen. We're not going to leave, we're not going to leave you to this. And I think that that's really important. And I think that gives us hope, and that makes us happy, because we know that, at least people are willing to still put their neck on the line, and they are willing to still stand up for this. And, they will try not to leave these women who are now basically have been discarded by the Supreme Court. They are going to try and make it not so difficult for them. And I think that that's important. and that gives us hope.
Yeah, I think that something that came out of this was just a massive display of solidarity by women, and even by certain companies who were willing to pay for their employees to cross state lines, or do what they needed to do in order to get an abortion. So one question that we do have from the audience discusses, it says, so this is actually population politics instead of caring for the poor women's rights. Also, how is pregnancy viewed as an illness healthcare when it is a natural biological reproductive process? This person comments on the sort of abortion rates for minorities. So is this something where, I suppose the question is kind of talking about the dual experience that people have who are minorities and people of color and perhaps of less socioeconomic status versus women who are obviously able and financially able to access abortions. And you sort of touched on that a bit, but I think that that's an important point definitely to be made, that just as we live in two Americas, we live also in a really stark socioeconomic differences between the have and the have-nots, as you said. But if you have any final comments to offer, that might be nice.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the point about statistics, you're right, it didn't change. Well, you said that it didn't change the reproductive rate among the poor and minorities. No, possibly not. And about, the white reproductive rate, I mean, that also comes with affluence, and there's suddenly it became the in thing to have 3 or 4 children as opposed to 2, and I mean, so these things, there's a lot tied up in reproductive rates. So I think that's it is what it is, and so. But I think definitely I don't know which comment appears first, but it's definitely population politics, I think, and I think that this is very much a decision that plays to the political elite in many ways, that doesn't say anything nice about the court. And I think that the dissenting opinion is very clear about that. And I think that it's a shame. I mean, the US, as you asked, they do treat, I found it really interesting. They treat it as a disability, pregnancy as a disability, and having a child as a disability. Like you have to get special disability insurance in order to get paid while, when you're on leave for having a cesarean. And so that is just shocking. And I think for me, not because I live in the UK, and I think just understanding, and in Europe in general, the maternity leave rates are much, or the maternity leave arrangements are much, more friendly to women. But I mean, I just find it shocking that in the US, I have friends that went back to work 3 days after they had babies because they couldn't, they would lose their job, or they could get fired, a few weeks before they were due to give birth, so that their companies didn't have to pay their insurance. I mean, there are so many issues that are wound up in the US. And a lot of it has to do with the amount of power that private industry and healthcare industry has in a privatized. I mean, it is not a glowing picture for privatized healthcare, because it does nothing but benefit those who have the most. And I think that I never really understood that fully until I had lived away from the US for a long time, and now I think it's quite clear. So
I think that is definitely something that, if you look, as we said, it's a constellation of issues, and there's so many laws that, including the fact that you don't have to pay for maternity and paternity leave, that really shows that we don't necessarily have the value that we say we do for families and for life that we do in the US. So I think that that's something that moving forward, hopefully, with the election of hopefully some more progressives and just a change of pace and really more activism in the United States will come about over time. But thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to all of our audience members for attending.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Take care, everybody.